Hi there! Today we're going to be talking about the history and introduction to the artist grid tool, also known as, dun 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 dun, in olden times, the drawing machine. So let's talk about the term artist grid. Let's start with the word artist. By artist we mean visual artists, usually working in drawing, painting, and printmaking, such as Jean Alphonse on the right and Edward Manet on the left. The term grid we're going to define as an evenly spaced repeating shape, creating a pattern vertically, meaning up and down, and horizontally, left to right. You're probably familiar with grids from math class or your math homework where you had to plot out X and Y coordinates on a grid. Or maybe if you think of a map or a globe, those are both great everyday examples of a grid. So together we're combining artist grid to create artist grids, which an example is on the left. And you can actually purchase an old-timey artist grid, but we're going to talk about how we use them either with photographs, or I'm also going to show you a homemade one that I made. Let's talk about art in general. Have you ever stared in a museum and saw a real-life painting and you thought, oh my gosh, how did they do that? How did they get everything so perfect? How did they know the proper proportions and the angle of this glass? Or the little cap here, how did they know how to get it just right? Another example is from Vermeer. We have the milkmaid. How did they get the proportions of her body exactly correct? And the foreshortening of her hand, where we see the front of her fingers and then her arm is going back in space. Well, sometimes when you see something that's just so perfect and you're wondering, how could I ever do that? How did they do that? They might have used an artist grid, or i.e. a drawing machine. The idea of an artist grid goes back thousands of years. So in this example from 5600 BC, this is a drawing board from ancient Egypt, and it's of King Thutmose III. And what you can see is the artist is unknown, but this artist created a sketch, and we can see his figure here, and he's twisting for Egyptian proportions to be just right. But in the background in red, you can see a tiny little grid. And I went over it just so you can visually see where the lines are, so hopefully that helps. So what this artist did was they had a small tiny little piece of wooden board, and on top they created a small drawing. In the end then, what would happen is however many squares are here, let's say 1, 2, 3, let's say 12 across and maybe 17 down. So if I wanted to create this, and this probably went on a temple wall as a painting or a carving, what I could do is if these are squares, meaning the tops and sides and bottoms are all equal, I could recreate this and enlarge it as big as I wanted. So if this one square here on my tiny sketch is, let's say, 1/2 centimeter, I could blow it up to one square representing 1 foot. So I could enlarge this so this exact sketch will become monumental. And that's exactly what they were doing. So if you ever see huge, large carvings into walls or into stone or large wall paintings, they were probably done in this way to keep everything even and in proportion. The same thing was happening in ancient Greece. So not only were artists using this for two-dimensional objects, they were utilizing it for three-dimensional objects. So let's say if I made a sketch two-dimensionally in pencil, on paper of some kind, and it was small, I could use and grid this out. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 squares across, and let's say 18 down. I could recreate this really large, and that's exactly what they were doing. So here I have the same amount of squares, 6 across and maybe however many down. I could recreate this into stone. So if I have a drawing of what I want my sculpture to look like from the front and from the side, I could plot this out and enlarge it on the front and back, and I could use this as a guide to carve away and chip away stone, bit of stone after stone after stone to get to my final statue. In the Northern Renaissance, Albrecht Dürer was a famous drawer and printmaker. He actually recorded the practice of using an artist grid or a drawing machine. So I'm actually going to zoom in for a moment so you can see what's going on. So he has an actual frame. So this is a frame, a wooden frame, and then measured out evenly because it's a grid. There are 6 squares across and 6 squares down. On his piece of paper, it's the same. There's 6 squares across and 6 squares down. He also has a little vertical instrument right here that tells him where to place his eye. So let's say he had to get up, go to the bathroom, grab a snack, come back. He knows exactly how to set up his face in regards to space and angle of looking back at his figure. So he could start in the middle, or let's say he started up top. So if he started in the top left, whatever he saw in this top left square, and it might be nothing. If it's nothing, then he would just leave that blank. But wherever he would start seeing his figure appear, her head, her elbow, whatever, then that's exactly how he would plot out his drawing. So he's using the artist grid as a tool. It's a drawing machine per se. Here's another example, and this is an engraving, so it's a print from Abraham Boss. And now this time the artist is on the left, the patron is on the right. He could be a prince or nobleman, so now we're in the 1700s. So as you can see, this idea was passed down from generation to generation. Artists that went to school, they were taught this by their teacher, and it was passed down from pupil to pupil. So now the prince or the nobleman is on the right. He's having to stay very still and not move. And the artist is on the left. And again, the same amount of squares, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I think there's 7 this time. So there's 7 squares across. He has 7 squares on his paper. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 squares down. He has 8 squares there. And you can see there's a face emerging. Now let's bump to the 1800s. We have the famous artist Vincent van Gogh on the left. Here's a self-portrait of Vincent. And actually, we have Theo on the right. I know down here it says self-portrait, question mark, question mark, question mark. And that's because just recently, this painting through the Van Gogh Institute has been proven to actually be of Theo. It's not a self-portrait. This is Theo. You can tell a little bit difference in the features of the nose. His nose has a sharper angle. His ear is a bit softer. But I'm digressing. So let's go back to the story. So Van Gogh writes a letter to his brother Theo. And in the letter, he actually sketches out his drawing machine that he bought. And he just went to the blacksmith and asked the blacksmith to punch more holes so he can kind of alter the frame to create grids in different ways. And also asking for more nails. So he has a wooden frame and nails, and then he can apply the string as he wishes. So in this example, you can see there's a quadrant grid, so there's 4 horizontal rectangles, and then also there's diagonals. So he's actually creating a grid using triangles. Here's a close-up. And in the letter, this has been translated. He writes on to Theo, so on the shore, or in the meadow, or in the fields, one can look through it as through a window. The vertical lines and the perpendicular line of the frame certainly give a few basic markers, with the help of which one can make a firm drawing. With long and continuous practice, it enables one to draw quick as lightning. So on the left is an actual color photograph taken more recently of Langlois Bridge. And Vincent van Gogh would go out and paint plein air, so outside, and in real life. I don't know, I can't guarantee, I cannot confirm that he used his drawing machine, but in the letter is from the year 1882. And then this painting is from 7 years later in 1889. So 7 years later, he probably is pretty good and pretty quick at using his drawing machine, so he might have used it for this painting. Another example of when Van Gogh was in the hospital in Arles, France. Here's an actual color photograph. Here's a painting that Van Gogh did, again in 1889. A more contemporary artist using the artist grid, or drawing machine as it was called, is Chuck Close. When we say a contemporary artist, we mean somebody of our times, of modern times. Chuck Close is a very famous artist. He started in the 60s, and this is actually a self-portrait. So on the lower left, we see the actual photograph that he's using. So Chuck Close wants to create really precise photorealistic paintings. He wants them to look as real as possible. So you can see he has tons of tiny little squares. His grid is very detailed. The more detailed your grid, the more squares you have, then the more detailed and more efficiency you'll have at creating a very precise, proportionally placed drawing to begin with. And when I say these are big, they are big. So here's another example. This is of Mark in 1978. They are huge. They are up to 9 feet tall. You can see the size of this lady in comparison to this wall. They're 8 to 10 feet tall, typically. Later, so now we're seeing an example from 2010 of Chuck Close. This is another self-portrait, but you can see he's really now pushing the idea of using a grid as a tool. He's not just using typical squares charted out like graph paper. He's purposely rotated them at a 45-degree angle, making little diamond shapes. So he's pushing the idea of what a grid could constitute as an artist's tool, and he's also using it as part of the design. It is obvious that there is a grid being used, but because of the beauty of the grid, we're seeing those lines, we're seeing those edges, and the style that he's choosing to use color and shape is purposely related to the grid. Another example is from the famous painter Chuck Close painting a portrait of another famous artist, Carol Walker. Not only could a grid necessarily have to be just squares or just rectangles, as long as the shape is repeated vertically and horizontally, you can use different shapes. So for example, here's another self-portrait from 2013 of Yellow Raincoat. If we zoom in, you can see originally the grid, and we can see it. You can actually see the pencil marks of him creating an evenly spaced grid, but instead of squares in the end, he's using circles. I'm going to zoom out one more time just so you can see that, but up close, it's circles. Chuck Close really played with this idea, not just using squares, not just using rectangles or rotating them, but you could use any shape as long as when you're blowing it up, your shapes stay proportionate. They're the same shape throughout. So here we have Lucas, his friend, and in the center we have a circle that's divided up into pieces, and it's radial circles that are growing out larger and larger as they expand. This is such a great idea that I think a lot of students and you could push further. So now let's go back. So maybe you've seen either on Pinterest or on Google, or one of your friends have done a project like this in high school where we see a grid being used and you wonder, oh my gosh, how did they do that? It's an permanent marker. How would they have the skill to do that? Well, now you know they're creating a grid. They're using an artist grid or a drawing machine. So let's go back to real life. So let's say you want to create a really super hyper realistic drawing or painting of your friends. So this is a photo I took. These are my friends, Chris and Val. And they say, oh my gosh, please, can we have a drawing of this? It would be great. And I say, wow, okay, well, that's a lot of challenge going on. I have 2 faces. I have 2 different body types. Different styles of clothing, wrinkles, arms, hands, fingers. How am I going to do this? They want it to look realistic. Well, guess what? We have a tool to use. So this tool could be used for portraits. It's really great for. It could also be used for really detailed landscapes. So here's another photo I took. There's so much detail. There's tiny little houses. There's big houses. There's a lot of overlapping. How am I going to fit all this? What if I start drawing it by freehand and I start drawing these top houses and then I'm halfway through and I run out of space? Well, if I want to make sure everything ends up where it should be in the proper placement and the proper size, I can use a grid. So let's go back to the portrait. If I'm pretty confident in my drawing skills, I'm really using the grid minimally. I could divide up my photo into quadrants. So I'm dividing quadrant, think of quarters, 4 quarters in a dollar, 4 quarters in a football game, 4 quarts in a gallon, so we got 4 quadrants. So if I have quadrants, then I can take a piece of paper, this is vertical, and I have a vertical rectangle on the right. Then this would help me quickly plot out, okay, I know the size Chris's head should be about this size. Valerie should be somewhere here. I can look at whatever's in my upper left square should be ending up in my upper left square. I can see whatever's in my upper right should be ending up in my upper right. If I'm still freaking out thinking, oh my gosh, how am I going to draw a face? This is still too hard just with quadrants. Well, you can get more specific. I just went from 4 squares into 16. So I squared 4. 4 squared. 4 times 4 is 16. So now this might be enough to help me out and help me plot out on my paper exactly where arms and legs and sizes of things should be. If it's still not enough help, you could keep going. You could keep going and make the most detailed grid if you need to. But the more of a grid you make, the more time it's taking, the more you have to plot out and figure out vertically how many squares you have, horizontally how many, and really plotting out. It depends how confident you are in your drawing. But the key is whatever you're blowing up or shrinking down or just drawing in ratio, the shape needs to be the same. If you have a vertical composition, your paper, your canvas cannot be horizontal. This is a vertical rectangle. This is not in proportion to this horizontal rectangle. If I try to plot out exactly where Valerie's face is in this upper left-hand rectangle onto my other piece of paper, it's not going to work. It's going to end up being warped. And I don't think you're going for that look. Okay? So that's really the biggest rule. Otherwise, you can keep making grids to your heart's delight. The other rules to think about are you have options. So if I have, let's say, a photograph, and my photograph is 8 by 10, and I want to make an exact 8 by 10 drawing, my photograph and my paper could be the same, and I could use a grid of however many squares, rectangle shapes that I need. You can also have something large, like a poster or a large printout or an advertisement that's large. I could shrink it and actually use a grid to make it smaller. The most common thing, though, is the last, and that's to have a small image, a photograph, a printout, something from a magazine, and it's smaller and you're wanting to blow it up and enlarge it bigger. So these examples of Chris and Val, the double portrait or the landscape, are from photos. Well, what if you're working from real life? We have the beloved still life right here. So let's say I needed help drawing this. Well, I could do the same thing and make my own drawing tool. And that's what I did right here. So this is an old slide. So it's pretty much just a piece of plastic with a nice, perfect rectangular hole in the middle. What I did was I took 2 pieces of string and I evenly spaced out and taped on the back. You can see the little pieces of tape where I placed the string, and now I have a little window. I have quadrants. So if I use that, so if I have quadrants in my little viewfinder and I evenly space out my quadrants on my piece of paper, I'm golden. I can use this as my drawing machine. It is an artist tool. It's a grid. So then once I set up my still life and figure out exactly what I want to place where, I look through my little viewfinder and I can see exactly what I should be drawing. I have to take note of the placement of where I'm sitting every time I return. I also take note of the distance from my eyeball to the actual viewfinder, because if one day I'm 2 inches away from my eyes and the next day I'm fully extending my arm, the inside of the frame is going to look completely different and that won't help. It needs to stay consistent. So once I have exactly what I want in my composition, I took another photo, but I focused on the background so you can see exactly what I'm wanting in my drawing. I can do the same thing now, just like I showed in the photograph. It's exactly the same scenario, except I'm taking 3D actual objects that I'm drawing from observation, but now I'm drawing them on a 2-dimensional surface. If you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, that's the end of our video today.